Okay, so I think we should go ahead and get started. We have a bit to cover tonight. And first of all, I want to thank everyone who has taken the opportunity and responsibility, should I say, to join this discussion tonight. I know that there are other places you can be. First of all, my name is Keisha Rogers, and thank you for joining the LaRouche Pack class series with Susan Kokenda. And I said what I said in starting because I know that the of President Donald Trump is in Phoenix, Arizona, and has just started his speech. But you have made the right decision to be on this discussion tonight because President Trump is going to do what he's going to do, but you have to be prepared to wage the necessary battle which we are embarking upon right now. So let me just give you a sense of what we're going to be discussing tonight before I turn it over to Susan. First of all, as you know, this class series has been on the question of the weapons to defeat the oligarchs and Democrats. And tonight's discussion is going to be titled Plato and the Pursuit of Happiness. So I thought how Susan situated her idea about her class for tonight was very important in the context of what has transpired over the recent period, but how to understand the fight that we're really in right now. So, as the theme for tonight's discussion was written, and you may have received this email, it states, as we discussed, as Susan discussed in the first class in this series, Plato and the 2,500-year-old Republican Party, the Persian Empire could not defeat Athens by military means. It corrupted the thinking of Athens leaders and citizens alike, causing Athens to self-destruct. So too, the British Empire could not militarily defeat our republic, despite several attempts culminating in the Civil War. Instead, it has poisoned our thinking. The evils of critical race theory and the Green New Deal are obvious to patriots. But what about Adam Smith and the free market? How are those ideas in direct violation of the concept of the republic as developed by Plato? And what does the examination of the ordering of the cosmos have to do with statecraft? Now, that's a very interesting question, and I'd like to hear how Susan's going to answer that. Before I turn it over to Susan, I want to let everyone know that this is the exact fight that we're actually taking to the streets directly. As we speak here, we have a number of people who have been engaged in discussions today in Arizona. We have our team there in Arizona at the Turning Point meeting. We have a team also that went to freedom rallies and events in California today, and also in Michigan. And we'll hear more about those events a little bit later. But one thing that struck me today when we talk about this question of how the citizenry is being brainwashed and the corruption of the minds of the citizens, the minds of the youth, as was reflected in an article that was posted today by one of my colleagues that came from a publication called The American Thinker. And this had a very shocking effect on me and probably a lot of people who read it. It's called Parents Counseled by Their Own Children. And I wanted to bring this up because what the article is going through is the fact that, you know, these parents are in agony and they're distraught by the fact that their children have disowned them, have counseled them because of the model and agenda that has been set out by those involved with the radical left agenda. And the reason why these parents are saying they've been counseled is because the children were told that their parents are brainwashing them and are manipulating them. And so what the person who writes the article talks about is how she picked up a copy of the book of Saul Alinsky's Rule for Radicals, and also the book by Horowitz entitled Barack Obama's Rules for Revolution. And basically, this idea was that this concept that truth exists has to be stopped, and that these young people should try to go and dissuade their parents from truth, from the idea of Christian, Judeo-Christian principles of how we come to know that which is true. If they were for Trump, then the parents should disown them. So people should look at this article. I'm not going to go through it in detail too much, but it was very striking to see this, because this is exactly what we're facing right now. And it was directed at particularly middle-class whites. And, you see, this is beyond, and really goes to show what the policy coming from those pushing the critical race theory, the Black Lives Matter, and so forth. So the question becomes now, as Susan's going to lay out for us, how is it that we come to understand this idea of what is the Platonic conception of how our nation was founded, on what it is that Plato and Aristotle, as we are going to continue to develop even beyond this class series, is not just about differing philosophies. This is about the idea that human beings are created in the image of the Creator. And that as we think about the fight that we're in the midst of right now, a lot of people have said that's not a question we should take up, but it is the essential question that we should take up right now. And we're going to do that, and we'll come back to discussion and questions and answers from you guys from last week, and also what Susan is going to present on tonight. So go ahead, Susan. Let's get started here.
All right. Thank you, Keisha. Look, what Keisha just mentioned in terms of parents being canceled by their children, anybody who's at all familiar with the history of Socrates and Plato has to just stop and think about the tyranny of the mob, because that's what you're dealing with. Socrates was executed precisely because he wanted to teach truth to young people. That put him in made him a direct threat to the imperial forces that were directing Athens at that time. So these questions of truth, these questions of universal principles, they're as relevant, in our own living rooms today as they were 2,500 years ago. And as we face the crisis of our republic, with this being one aspect of it, and as Keisha said, Donald Trump is speaking in Phoenix right now, addressing another crisis of our republic, the question of the sanctity of our elections, and I'm sure he'll be addressing many other things as well. People know we're in a grave crisis. And many people are mobilized, trying to defend our republic. But the problem is they have been denied the very principles upon which a republic is founded, such that they can actually effectively defend it. You cannot defend a republic on the basis of some kind of formal structure. It's not the balance of powers in the separation of powers in our government, the three branches of government. It's not big government versus little government. The only way that you can defend a republic is if you recognize that its very essence is embedded in the concept of universal principles, and that the purpose of the dialogue of a democratic republic is to discover those universal principles such that you can effectively govern. You cannot really have statecraft without science. You also can't have economics without these same kind of conceptions of the republic. And tonight, what I want to do is I want to bring out a critical element of Plato's thinking, which puts him in very, very stark contrast to a famous economist of the past whose ideas continue to pollute almost everything that we do today, and that is Adam Smith and the people who come from the Adam Smith school. Now, Plato didn't really write about economics. There's some discussion of economics in his work called The Laws, but I have reservations that Plato actually wrote it because frankly, it's pretty boring, and Plato is not boring. But despite the fact that he never really addressed the question of economics, he laid the basis for the breakthroughs in physical economics that were made by Leibniz, that were made by Alexander Hamilton, and that were made more recently by Lyndon LaRouche. Now, last week, we looked at Plato's dialogues and how he composed them as the antidote to the destruction of Athens at the hands of the imperial forces of Persia. And as Keisha mentioned, Athens repulsed the Persians militarily twice, relatively many decades before Socrates and Plato. But the destruction of Athens really came at the hands of the ideas which had infected them at the hands of this imperial outlook. Now, as we discussed last week, Plato not only wrote these dialogues in a very dramatic way, locating these dialogues at critical moments in the collapse of Athens, but Plato also, after the execution of his teacher Socrates in 399, launched a project for the rest of his life, which ended in 347. He launched a project to pull together the academy, to pull together the forces, to actually challenge the empire, using his ideas to try and somehow, some way, found something that had a resemblance to the kind of organized state that would be able ultimately to create a republic and challenge the Persians. It did not happen in his lifetime. One of his students, or one of the students of members of his academy, Alexander the Great, did conquer the Persians in a very, very short period of time and began a process of city building. But Alexander the Great, life was cut short. He was poisoned. He was poisoned by an associate of Aristotle, as we discussed somewhat last week. So we've gone a very, very long time between Plato's conception and the emergence of an actual republic in truth, which was the founding of the United States of America. During that period, the period from Alexander the Great to 1776, Plato was suppressed during many periods of Western European history. He was certainly slandered. He was certainly distorted and misrepresented. But despite all of that, his ideas were rediscovered, they were refound, they were refreshed, and they ultimately became the stream from which our republic was actually founded. The problem that we have today is, just as we discussed last week, the philosophical infections which people are not even conscious of. And the critical question, which I'm going to keep coming back to, is the question of universal principles and truth. What we looked at last week was the ideology of the Eleatics, who, while they believed there were universal principles, said that you couldn't know them, that it was some mystical thing which mankind actually had no access to. That very easily led to those such as the sophists, who said, well, then there just aren't any universal principles and we can do whatever we want. Many of Plato's dialogues are mental combat with the sophists, with the Eleatics, and with people who were the victims of the sophists and the Eleatics. And what I want to do initially is, and these became, and we've seen the development of very, very evil ideologies. When you take the question of the universal out of your conception of how to govern your society, how to govern yourself. Now, I want to look at one of the most perverse and satanic of those ideologies. And I hope I'm going to be tromping very hard on a lot of people's toes as I do this, because I want to look at the question of Adam Smith. And what is at the core of all of this is the very concept of what is your image of man and what is your image of reality. So I'm going to be showing bringing you a number of quotes from Adam Smith and then from Plato himself. It's a lot, but I think it's necessary for you to hear these things in the words of the authors themselves, rather than some kind of explanation of them. So I'm going to start with Adam Smith. This is something that Adam Smith wrote, and of course, I'm sure everybody knows. He wrote The Law of Nations. He's the father of the whole idea of free market philosophy. Many people, the Austrian school of von Hayek, Milton Friedman, many other people have sort of built on the basis of this. The piece that I'm going to identify, that I'm going to read from right now, is something that was written some years before The Wealth of Nations. That was 1776, actually written the year of our own Declaration of Independence. Obviously, I think the British were getting ready to figure out how to subvert whatever we were going to do. But this was written in 1759. And this just gets at the essence of the battle between empire and republic, or the battle between democracy and republic, or the battle between the Democratic Party of 2,500 years ago, which, as we discussed last week, is the Democratic Party of today, and the Republican Party of 2,500 years ago, which we have to recreate in the appropriate sense. So here's what Smith says. He says, the administration of the great system of the universe, however, and the care of the universal happiness of all rational and sensible beings is the business of God and not of man. To man is allotted a much humbler department, but one much more suitable to the weakness of his power and the narrowness of his comprehension. The care of his own happiness and that of his family, his friends, and his country. Thus, self-preservation and the propagation of the species are the great ends which nature seems to have proposed in the formation of all animals. I guess we're an animal. Mankind are endowed with a desire of those ends and an aversion to the contrary, with a love of life, a dread of dissolution, the desire of the continuance and perpetuity of the species, and with an aversion to the thoughts of its entire extinction. But though we are in this manner endowed with a very strong desire of those ends, it has not been entrusted to the slow and uncertain determinations of our reason to find out the proper means of bringing them about. Nature has directed us to the greater part of these by original and immediate instincts: hunger, thirst, the passion which unites the two sexes, the love of pleasure and the dread of pain prompt us to apply those means for their own sakes and without any consideration of their tendency to those beneficent ends which the great dictator of nature intended to produce in them. In other words, you can't know the consequences of your actions. You're not responsible for the consequences of your actions. Somehow, by simply acting on the basis of the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, the invisible hand is going to make it all work out, or the magic of the marketplace, and I might say it's the black magic of the marketplace, is going to make it all work out. Now, Smith is pretty bad, but the person who preceded him and whose writings he read and kind of rubbed the rough edges off those writings was a man named Bernard Mandeville, a Dutch so-called philosopher who wrote around earlier in the century. And he wrote something in 1714 called The Fable of the Bees, where he takes the example of a beehive as an example of society. He makes the argument that as long as the bees are operating from the standpoint of their basic instincts, then everything works fine. They have a great economy, they have a great little bee civilization and so on. But he posits that some amongst them start complaining that there's no virtue among them. So some arbitrary external being imposes virtues on the hive and the economy falls apart and everything falls apart. Now, you may not believe that it's really that bad, but it actually is in terms of his conceptions. Here is an excerpt of The Fable of the Bees. And you notice over here on the right, the subtitle of this is Private Vices, Public Benefits. So this is a section of the very bad, I hate to even call it a poem, that Mandeville wrote about how society has to function. And he really is talking about this is how human society and human economics should function. He says, and this is just one excerpt from this doggerel, thus every part was full of vice, and yet the whole mass a paradise. Flattered in peace and feared in wars, they were the esteem of foreigners, and lavish of the wealth and lives, the balance of all the other hives. Such were the blessings of that state. Their crimes conspired to make them great. And virtue, who from politics had learned 1,000 cunning tricks, was by their happy influence made friends with vice. And ever since, the worst of all the multitude did something for the common good. Now, this really was the basis for Adam Smith's conceptions. It's just put a little bit more crudely than the pursuit of pleasure, which is profit, and the avoidance of pain, which is loss. And what you see today in the 20th century in the form of the Austrian school of von Hayek, of Milton Friedman, of people of that ilk. In fact, the Austrian school, which was founded by von Hayek, other members of the Austrian school, and Milton Friedman, all look back to Mandeville. Now, they really don't want people to look all that closely at this, but this is actually the basis of their free trade, free market economics. And, look, what do we hear all the time these days? We hear the refrain of freedom. We need our freedom. Well, it's true that we are operating under an abomination of a government we're operating under policies that are destructive in every way you can possibly imagine. But the question of freedom is not simply we're under bad policies and I want to be free. Because what has been very much infected into our culture is this Mandevillian conception of freedom. Do we want the freedom to act like bees in Mandeville's hive to carry out crimes and vices? Do we want to have the freedom to act only on pleasure and pain, i.e. profit and loss? Or do we want to be free of the laws of the universe? Do we want to be free of our responsibilities as citizens of a republic? Do we want to be free of our commitment to the future? This takes us back to the question that we discussed last week and that I want to dive into more tonight. On the question of universals and on the question of the universe, and what is the nature of the universe? What are the principles and character of a universe, as opposed to this Mandevillian world where all we operate on is the basis of our basic instincts? What Plato challenges us to discover, and I'm going to be looking at two of his, just small windows into two of his works, which take on the question of, number one, the nature of the universe, and number two, the nature of our ability to know these universal principles. Because Plato challenged in the most fundamental way, the disgusting philosophy that we just heard. And these guys are not the only representatives of it, but I think because it is so predominant in the minds of so many patriots that these doctrines, the Mandevillian Smith doctrines, have anything whatsoever to do with the concept of a republic and have anything whatsoever to do with the people who founded our nation. I really want to take on these questions through the eyes of Plato. In coming weeks, not immediately perhaps, but in coming weeks, we plan on taking this question on from the standpoint of looking at the well springs of the actual American Revolution and how they have been so badly misrepresented in pointing to people like Smith and pointing to people like John Locke as their founders. The real founders come from a tradition from Plato. I mean, Plato put forward many paradoxes, some of which he solved, some of which it took centuries to solve, some of which have not yet been solved. But he established a concept of man in the universe, which is the foundation of the creation of our republic. And Plato did challenge directly this idea that you can't know universals, that there aren't any and you can't know them. He challenged it not only by affirming that there are universal principles, that, as we'll see in a few quotes in a minute, there is a creator, singular creator, and that man has a pathway for discovering these principles, never perfectly, but always less imperfectly. So again, I want to look at this. I want to give people some guideposts to the two great masterworks of Plato, which is the Timaeus and the Republic, around these kinds of conceptions. But before I turn to that, I want to read one more quote. I want to free your minds from the horrors of Mandeville and Smith, and read a quote from Lyndon LaRouche, where he directly addresses the question of Adam Smith. I'll skip the first paragraph because he basically just dissects Smith. This is a piece that LaRouche wrote in 2010, entitled How Adam Smith Fooled You Suckers, most of the time. And he goes through Smith's approach, and then he identifies his own. And he says, for me, as a matter of contrast, the root of economic crises in societies is to be found in a willful mankind's failure to understand the requirement for a willfully noetic quality of lawful ordering within a successful development of the productive processes. I mean, that is a mouthful. But then he continues, this noetic characteristic of human creative behavior is specific to the human will, but the same kind of principle is expressed unconsciously, but efficiently in such forms as the development of the solar system, the evolution of the lithosphere and biosphere of our planet Earth, and in the relatively exceptional case of the noetic aspect of the conscious will of the human personality. Now, I chose this not only because he attacked Adam Smith, but because he identified the fundamental difference between his conception and Plato's conception of man and Adam Smith and the imperial conception, which is our noetic capability. Now, this word noetic comes from the Greek word nous, which is spelled sort of N-O-U-S or N-O-O-S with an umlaut over the second O. And it's the Greek word for mind. So the noetic quality is the quality by which we use our mind. He says the noetic characteristic of human creative behavior is specific to the human will. So I wanted to introduce that idea before I turn to Plato and the Timaeus. Now, the Timaeus and the Republic were set within a day of each other. The Republic actually was set the first day, and then Socrates and a few of the same people who had been engaged in the dialogue in the Republic returned the next day to have the discussion with Timaeus, a new figure who entered the discussion, who was a great Pythagorean astronomer. I'm going to start with the Timaeus, because I think this question of the nature of the universe and man's role, man's place in the nature of that universe is fundamental to the discussion of creating a republic or anything else. So what I've done is I've taken a couple of conceptions, a couple of critical passages from the Timaeus, and to, again, just give you a crack into the extraordinary depth of Plato's thinking. What I've done, and I don't know if by doing it, I'm going to make it more complicated or less complicated, but we'll see. I've taken a couple of sections from Plato's Timaeus, and because it introduces two fundamental conceptions which Plato deals with all the time, I've highlighted the two different conceptions in two different colors. Again, I don't know if that's going to help or it's going to make it worse, but we'll see. Because what he immediately, and I'm going to say Plato, it's in the words of Timaeus, but obviously these are Plato's ideas as well as Timaeus's ideas. The first thing you have to address when you're dealing with the nature of reality is an essential difference. The difference between, as he says, that which eternally exists and has no becoming, that is, the eternal universals, versus that which is always coming into being, becoming, or you could use the word creation, But I'm using becoming because if you're going to read Plato, you have to get used to these kinds of concepts. And this is often how this particular concept is translated in most of the translations. And that which is always coming into being, becoming, and is never existent, by which he means it's not eternally existent. So the first, being eternally existent, is understood by thought, by aid of reason. So here we have noetic again, noesis. This is from the same concept as mind, nous. So you can understand the eternally existent. You can understand these universal principles through thought with the aid of reason, and reason there is logos. For those who might be familiar with the Greek translation of the New Testament in the Gospel of John, where it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Greek is logos. You could have translated that as reason. It is also used as word, but it's an embedded concept. So I'll read that again without the commentary. The first, being eternally existent, is understood by thought, by aid of reason. The second, which becomes, is created and perishes, that is never existent, is the object of opinion with the aid of unreasoning sense perception. So created things we see with sense perception, and unreasoning is just the Greek word for without logos, alogos. Then he turns to the actual question of the heaven or the cosmos or the universe itself. He uses, in this particular sentence, he uses both the word for heaven and the word for cosmos, which in Greek does mean sort of the ordering principle of the universe. So he says, now the whole heaven or cosmos, whatever we call it, we must first investigate the question which lies at the outset, whether it has existed always, having no beginning or of generation, or whether it has come into existence, having begun from some beginning. He makes the conclusion. It has come into existence, for it is visible and tangible and possessed of a body. That is, creation around us, the universe around us, is visible and tangible. And all such things are sensible. And sensible things are apprehensible by opinion with sensation, belonging to becoming and creation. And he again is working through these ideas. And so he's established that the created universe around us is not eternal. It was created. So if it was created, what paradigm, what model did the creator use to fashion it? And I'm not taking liberties with the word creator. This is Plato's conception. So he asks, however, let us return and inquire further concerning the universe. After which of the paradigms did its creator use to fashion it? Was it fashioned after the changeless and abiding, the eternal, or after that which has come into existence, the becoming? If this cosmos is beautiful and its creator good, it is plain that he looked to the eternal. And then he said it would be blasphemy to think the opposite, that he would look to anything any less than the eternal as the model. But it is clear that he looked to the eternal. For the universe is the most beautiful of all that has come into existence, and he is the most excellent of all causes. So having come into existence in this way, it is fashioned according to that which is comprehended by reason and intelligence and changes never. Now, think about that. That's a little paradoxical. The created universe partakes of becoming. It's not eternal, but it was modeled on the eternal. And therefore, it is comprehended by reason and intelligence. This is a very, very different world than the world of Adam Smith and Aristotle. Now we get, I think, to the direct slapdown of Adam Smith. Plato says, now let us state the cause for which he composed creation. He was good, and in him that is good, no envy ever arises. And being devoid of envy, he desired that all should be created so far as possible like himself. If that doesn't sound like a couple of lines from the book of Genesis, man created in the image of the living of God, I don't know what does. And he says, whoever accepts this foremost principle of creation and the cosmos, when it is offered by thoughtful men, is accepting it wisely. For God desired that so far as possible, all things should be good and nothing evil. Wherefore, when he took over all that was visible, and it was in a state of disorder and dissonance, he brought it into order out of disorder, deeming order better than disorder. For him who is most good, it is not permissible to commit any action other than the most beautiful. And then finally, this will be the end of the quotes from Timaeus, the Timaeus. After consideration, God found that among those things which are visible by nature, no whole creature that is without reason will ever be better than a whole creature which has reason. And that reason cannot come into existence, cannot dwell in anything that has no soul. So in forming the universe by composing reason inside soul and soul inside body, so that he might produce a work most beautiful and the best by nature. And in accordance with this most probable account, because Timaeus and Plato are saying, we're not going to get this exactly right, but this is the best we can do. We must say that this cosmos has come into existence as a living existence, endowed with soul and reason by the providence of God. And the Greek words are just beautiful. It's ensouled and nuosed, in a sense, by the providence of God. And then in conclusion, he says, for all these reasons, God made the universe a happy God. And yes, this is exactly the same concept of happiness, which is embedded in the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Every time I read this, I'm just awestruck by its power. Plato is clearly much closer to Christianity, although he lived 400 years before Christ, than Adam Smith or the Austrian school or Mandeville. Of course, Mandeville didn't even pretend. He attacked Christianity. He was a member of the Satanic Hellfire Clubs, which is obvious from his outlook. But think of what has now been developed in just these short passages. And again, this is just a tiny window. There are universals. The creator, one creator, used those universals, which are knowable to the mind, as the model for creation. Creation is ensouled. It has mind. The universe is based on the good, and it's happy. We're not dealing with a dead universe here of little hard balls bouncing around in empty space. In fact, in the Timaeus, Plato addresses questions of space and time, and he rejects the idea of absolute space and absolute time, a little bit of a precursor to Einstein and the concepts of relativity. And the rest of the Timaeus goes on to hypothesize the composition of the universe, dealing with various geometrical ideas and musical ideas and the Platonic solids, and then the composition of the earth and the composition of living things. Now, if you think back to the comments by Mr. LaRouche, we spoke of the lithosphere, the biosphere, and the noosphere. I mean, the Timaeus has those elements. clearly it addresses the question of the noosphere in terms of an ensouled living universe, but he deals with the creation of the earth, the lithosphere, the abiotic, or the non-living as it's called, and the biosphere, the creation of animals, the biotic, the living. And look, we are part of that creation by virtue of our participation in the noetic process. And that universe which we are a part of is good. That takes us to the Republic. Again, the setting of the dialogue was the day before the discussion which took place in the Timaeus. This is a discussion which is an extensive inquiry into the question of the principles of statecraft. How do we choose guardians of our state? It's come about through a very extensive discussion of what is justice, what are the other kinds of virtues needed. If you remember the discussion we had last week about in Plato's 7th letter, where he has this wonderful discussion of concept formation. And at one point he talks about how the different elements of ideas, rub against each other with friction until you get one of those sparks of a new idea. There's a whole lot of friction and rubbing going on in the dialogue and the discussion in the opening books of Plato's Republic. The Republic unfolds over 10 books. Now, I'm not even going to try and characterize the cast of characters or the arguments, just that there are a lot of propositions put forward about how to educate the guardians. We're all familiar with the concept of the philosopher king, which comes out of the Republic. But without giving too much away, I want to assert that much of the misinterpretation or slanders of Plato come from people who never read the whole book or never got past book 5 or stopped thinking before they got to the end of the book. Because in book 6 of the Republic, Plato says we have to start all over again. Because there's something greater than all the characteristics we have spoken of. We've spoken of justice and bravery and temperance and other virtues, and his associates are pretty shocked. You will be too. You should get together with a group of people, assign characters, start reading the Republic. It gets pretty frictional in those first chapters, and people go through a lot of work in the first chapter. So they're pretty shocked when he says, but wait a minute. And Socrates says, wouldn't it be absurd for us to put all of this effort into things of trifling moments without demanding the greatest effort in the greatest of matters? And what is that? And here we're back to an essential conception from the Timaeus. The greatest thing, Socrates says, is to learn the idea of the good. At another point in this same section, they remark, everything we've discussed has not included a study of any such concept of the good that we are now seeking. And then in another pre-echo of the New Testament of St. Paul's in the Corinthians, that you have nothing if you don't have love, Socrates said, it would avail us of nothing, just as no possession either is of any avail without the possession of the good. So now this is the question, this pursuit of the good. In the Timaeus composed the universe, which is good and alive. But then the question is, how do we know it? How do we know what that is? Now, Socrates jumps in at that point of the Republic and he says, I don't think I can handle the question of the absolute good. That is a pitch too high for our wings. But I think we can look at the offspring of the good. And that is really man's participation in the continuing creation of this created universe. This is what has to reshape, and where they come to in the Republic, they basically realize they have to reshape everything they think about education, training leaders, the composition of society. It has to be shaped from this pursuit of a concept of the good. Now, Plato gives us an allegory to help us in the mental process that we have to undertake in this search for the good. And I suspect people have heard of this if they're not familiar with it, but I am going to grab an illustration of this. This is the allegory of the cave. Because again, we've dealt with in the Republic, we've dealt with in the Timaeus, obviously much more extensively than these short excerpts have been able to avail you of, but we've dealt with the fact that you have two domains. You have the domain of the senses, and you have the domain of universal principles and the mind. So Plato develops this allegory of the cave to illustrate how, when you're trapped in the senses, you're not really seeing the essence of things. So this isn't a bad illustration of it. He says, imagine you have people who are chained to a wall, chained so that they can only look toward the back of a cave. They can't turn their heads. Behind them is a wall, and behind the wall is a source of light. And then you see, obviously, you have people parading images between the light and the wall of the cave. So the people who are the slaves who are chained, all they can see is the images on the wall. They can't see what is generating them. And if it's all they have ever seen, then they think this is reality. And I mean, what Plato then takes up in terms of the question of education is, how do you free people from this dependence and reliance on their senses as the idea that this is an accurate representation of anything real? What kind of education, what kind of disciplines and methods do we have to put people through so that they are capable of looking in this direction of these higher principles of the good? What he does in the rest of the Republic is he walks you through the essence of a curriculum for a republic. And frankly, people who are battling critical race theory would do well to look at what Plato discusses in this section of the Republic. He addresses the essential so-called subjects: arithmetic, geometry, spherical geometry, and then what he calls spherical geometry in motion, by which he means astronomy, the motion of the planets in the heavens, and music. But always from the standpoint of how these subjects, if properly taught, will cause you to look at the deeper principles of things. There's one amusing point in the Republic when the person who's in dialogue with Plato says, "Oh, I understand why we have to study astronomy, because it will cause us to look up, to the heavens." And Socrates, the actual personage in the dialogue, Socrates says, "No, it's not a question of what you see with your eyes. It's the paradoxes that you're going to have to confront that will lead you to discover the deeper principles which are behind the ordering of the bodies that we see, the heavenly bodies that we see in the skies." And I mentioned last week that this was one of the challenges which Plato gave to all the members of the Republic, of the Academy, was to figure out the most accurate representation of the motions of the heavenly bodies. to create a model which accounted for it most accurately, something which wasn't done with the proper kind of precision until we got to Kepler many, many centuries later, who acknowledged his debt to Plato and the Pythagoreans in terms of his ideas. So when you look at the, when you go through the kinds of exercises which Plato works you through in these dialogues, and these are, I mean, some dialogues are more of a exercise in his method. Others get much more deeply into these questions of the nature of reality, the nature of how man knows reality. But as you begin to immerse yourself in these, whatever the particular character or nature of a dialogue is, especially if you work yourself through the Timaeus and the Republic, these are challenging. There are sections of the Timaeus which demand a lot of work. You have to stop, you have to figure out what he's saying. You may not be able to do it by yourself. You may, in most likelihood, as most of us did, have to have a group of people together working through what Plato is talking about in terms of the arithmetic, geometric, and harmonic means, the significance of the Platonic dialogues, Platonic solids, the significance of the musical intervals. But when you think of it from the standpoint of the parable of the cave, all of these things are challenges to, through your senses, in a sense, not to your senses, but they're challenges through your senses to figure out what the deeper principles are, and to figure out, and in this journey, in the pursuit of the knowledge of the good. So if you look at the premises of Adam Smith and Mandeville, and they're just more blatant than some of their 20th century or 21st century versions of it. They let it all hang out, especially Mandeville. But what are they really saying? They're saying every decision that you make, you're operating purely from the standpoint of your bestial senses, your animal instincts, the shadows on the wall. That's all it is. No wonder our economics don't work. We're playing with shadows. We're playing with money and economic indicators. These are just shadows of something else. They're almost like derivatives of shadows. Rather than what actually shapes economics, which is the physical universe. We run after images. No wonder that our republic is in shambles. We're shadow boxing. We chase after the shadows rather than that which creates the shadows. I mean, take, for example, the ongoing coup against Donald Trump. We all know the shadows, the Democrats, the mainstream media, big tech, the Davos elite. These are all the shadows. But what is the principle that generates the hatred of Trump and the hatred of our republic? It is the imperial principle embodied in the British Empire, which wants to stamp out the idea of a sovereign republic organized under this conception of Plato's universe and Plato's republic. And what did they see in Donald Trump? Somebody who certainly by instinct, by impulse, by passion, wants to revive that kind of republic and awakens that within the population. That's the essence of the attacks on Trump, not the shadows that we spend too much time fighting. So to go back to the question of economics, and the absurd shadows that we're dealing with in terms of money and economic indicators and profit and loss and behavioral science and all the things that go into the practice of so-called economics today. Where is the physical universe in any of that? Where is any kind of rigorous conception of a principle of the good, of the noetic principle? A noetic principle, which, as both LaRouche in that opening comment and throughout the entire Timaeus, the noetic principle, the noetic creative principle, is common to man and to the universe. There can be no statecraft, and there frankly can be no economics outside of the pursuit of the good and the knowledge of the universe. You can't separate either the governance of your country or the support for your population, which is economics, from the pursuit of the good, from the ever-developing knowledge of the universe. So if we want to save our republic, we're going to have to completely reject a world which is based on the pursuit of pleasure. And instead, we're going to have to start to rediscover and live in a world which is based on the pursuit of the good, as Plato defined it so brilliantly in these dialogues. So I hope I've given you some guideposts. There is no way to communicate the full power and the incredible depth of unfolding ideas that Plato unfolds in these two dialogues. But I hope I've given you a sense of the absolute importance of rethinking these fundamental questions, of getting to the very premises of what we think the nature of reality is, of man's role in that reality, how we participate in that, how we know that, and stop acting on the basis of autopilot slogans, which fall so easily off the tongue, which have led us, too many people, into the deadly embrace of people who are absolutely satanic, like Adam Smith and Bernard Mandeville. So I'll conclude with that, and we can have some dialogue, Platonic or otherwise.